Hello everyone, welcome to Sleep Space. Tonight we will talk about something that quietly haunts the edges of human existence. What happens to the self when memory begins to fade? Imagine waking up one morning with no memory of who you are. Your mind is a blank page. You see your reflection, but it doesn't stir anything within you. The face looking back might as well be a stranger. Would you still be you? This isn't just a question for philosophy. It's one that medicine, neuroscience, and psychology all wrestle with in different ways. Because memory isn't just a storage system for experiences, it's the thread that weaves the tapestry of who we believe we are. Studies show that nearly 55 million people worldwide are currently living with dementia, and that number is expected to almost double by 2050. In each of those lives, memory loss isn't just the forgetting of names and faces. It's the quiet unraveling of identity. But does the disappearance of memory necessarily mean the disappearance of the self? Or is there something deeper that remains untouched? Something beyond the boundaries of what we can recall? Neuroscience tells us that memory is incredibly fragile. Even in healthy individuals, up to 70% of memories are reconstructed inaccurately when recalled. We don't replay the past, we recreate it. Each time you remember something, your brain edits and reshapes the story, merging truth and imagination until they become one. This means that the you built from memory is already a living fiction, a narrative constantly rewritten. So if memory is the foundation of identity, then your sense of self has always been less a monument and more a river, something shifting and moving even while you feel still. Think of it. Who you were 10 years ago might feel like another person entirely. The habits, the beliefs, even the tone of your inner voice. They've all evolved, but there's still a you that persists through it all. Something that observes the changes without being fully consumed by them. Philosophers have called this the continuity illusion, the sense that we are one unbroken being across time, when in reality, our personality, our body, and our memories have all been replaced and reshaped. The atoms that make you up are replaced every 7 to 10 years. Your memories rewrite themselves. Your cells, your thoughts, your emotions, all in constant flux. And yet when you say I, you mean something consistent, something that feels whole. So maybe the question isn't just what happens to us when memory fades, but what exactly is the us that remains when it does. Consider this. People who lose their memory after severe brain injury can still display traces of their former self, mannerisms, emotional reactions, even values. A study from the University of Iowa found that patients with profound amnesia could still feel emotional responses toward loved ones they didn't consciously remember. Their bodies remembered, even if their minds could not. This phenomenon, known as emotional memory, suggests that the self might extend beyond explicit recollection. Your identity could live not only in your stories, but in your emotional and physiological patterns, in the way your body tenses at certain sounds, in the subtle warmth that rises when you hear a familiar tone, in the muscle memory of kindness. If those emotional imprints persist, perhaps the self is less a story and more an energy, a frequency that hums beneath awareness, one that doesn't vanish when the surface flickers, but continues to vibrate beneath the silence. Still, it's easy to fear the loss of memory. When we picture Alzheimer's or dementia, we often imagine a person disappearing into the fog, a soul dissolving into emptiness. But neuroscience paints a more nuanced picture. Researchers have found that people with dementia still respond to music, poetry, and touch long after they've forgotten their loved ones' names. The part of the brain that processes music, the auditory cortex, remains remarkably resilient. In one experiment at the University of Utah, researchers played familiar songs for patients with severe Alzheimer's. Brain scans showed bursts of activity in areas associated with emotion, attention, and self-awareness, even when those same patients couldn't recall the song or the person who played it. So perhaps the self doesn't fade entirely, perhaps it changes form, maybe it retreats into something quieter, no longer a sequence of remembered moments, but a pulse, a rhythm, a presence, like a candle's flame shrinking, not dying, burning more softly, but still there. And if that's true, then losing memory isn't the same as losing identity. It might be losing the story of who we are, while the essence of who we are remains. After all, the self has always been a story we tell ourselves, a continuous narrative that gives life coherence. But when that story fades, what if another kind of knowing takes its place? One that doesn't need language or sequence to exist? Maybe what fades is the voice of the storyteller, not the being itself. You've probably had moments where a certain smell, a piece of music, or a flash of colour pulled you back into a forgotten memory. For a second, it's as though time folds in on itself. You're back in that old room, that old feeling. Memory in those moments doesn't just replay the past, it recreates it, almost perfectly. But what if one day those moments stop coming? If the scent no longer stirs recognition, or the song feels like nothing more than sound? Does that mean a piece of you is gone? Or is it simply hidden beneath the noise of the world? The science of memory gives us a strange paradox. On one hand, memory defines us. On the other, it deceives us. Every memory you hold has already been altered, reinterpreted, or edited by your mind. In a study published by Nature Neuroscience, researchers found that each time we recall an event, we subtly change it. The hippocampus, the brain's memory hub, reopens that memory for editing, meaning even your most vivid recollections are not faithful records, but recreations. Yet we build our entire sense of self upon these distortions. The person you think you are is built upon an internal mythology, one that's part truth, part dream. According to the American Psychological Association, around 37% of people have at least one false memory of a major life event. It could be something as simple as misremembering who said a certain phrase first, or as profound as recalling an event that never occurred. If even our most certain memories can deceive us, then what exactly anchors our identity? Perhaps the self is not the sum of memories, but the pattern that holds them together, a kind of underlying structure that gives shape to experience. Neuroscientists at MIT discovered something fascinating in 2023. Even when specific memories were artificially suppressed in mice, the neural pattern associated with the memory persisted in dormant form. When reactivated later, the behavior linked to that memory resurfaced. In other words, the memory's shape remained, even if the conscious mind had lost it. That idea changes everything. It means memory might not be gone when it fades. It might simply become inaccessible, locked away, but still influencing us beneath awareness. And that has enormous implications for how we think about identity. If forgotten memories still shape your decisions, then you are more than the conscious story you remember. You are also the unseen architecture, the invisible layers of experience that continue to guide your emotions, your preferences, even your instincts. A team from Stanford University analysed decision-making patterns in patients with partial amnesia. They discovered that even when participants couldn't recall specific past experiences, they still chose consistently with their former preferences. One patient, who couldn't remember ever liking a certain type of music, still gravitated toward it instinctively. The memory was gone, but its influence remained. So maybe the self is not erased when memory fades. It lingers like an echo. Psychologists call this implicit memory, the unconscious residue of learning and experience. It's the reason you can still ride a bike after years away, or type without looking at the keyboard. Implicit memory can persist long after explicit recall has vanished. In fact, studies show that procedural memory, the memory of learned skills, is one of the last to deteriorate in Alzheimer's disease. Even in the late stages, some patients can still dance, paint, or hum along to familiar melodies. These moments defy the idea that selfhood is tied purely to recollection. There's a tenderness in that. It suggests that the self might be less about what we remember and more about what we embody. The gestures, the reactions, the ways we move through the world, all these become containers of identity. It's as though we are composed of layers: the conscious self, what you can name and describe; the emotional self, what you feel but can't explain; and beneath that, the embodied self, what you carry in movement and instinct. Even when the first layer fades, the deeper ones remain, whispering through the body's language. But there's another side to this, a quiet danger in how we link memory and self. When someone loses their memories, society often treats them as if they've disappeared. Loved ones say, they're not really here anymore. But maybe that's not true. Maybe what we call disappearance is really transformation, a shift from narrative identity to presence-based identity. In one long-term observational study by the University of Exeter, caregivers of people with late-stage dementia reported that 68% of patients still expressed consistent emotional patterns: kindness, humour, stubbornness, even after losing nearly all autobiographical memory. The essence of their personality remained visible. It's as if identity is less a library of memories and more a frequency that continues to resonate even when the words are gone. When you think about it, your sense of self has already survived countless little erasures. You've forgotten thousands of days from your childhood, entire conversations, moments of laughter, tears, embarrassment, love. But somehow, you still feel continuous, as though a deeper thread has carried you through. That thread might be attention itself, the observer within consciousness that experiences rather than remembers, the self that looks out through the eyes in this very moment, unanchored from the past. In this light, the fading of memory doesn't mean the fading of self. It means the self returns to something purer, awareness without a story, being without a name. We may spend our lives defining ourselves by what we remember, but maybe our truest identity exists in what remains when remembering ends. Not a list of facts, but a feeling. Not a timeline, but a presence. And perhaps that's where the mystery of who we are truly begins. There's a quiet illusion in memory, the belief that remembering is what keeps you real. You might think that as long as you can recall your past, your self is intact. But what if memory isn't proof of who you are, but rather the evidence of who you've been? In a study published in the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience, researchers found that the average person forgets up to 60% of newly learned information within 24 hours. By the end of 1 month, more than 80% of those details vanish. This means most of what you experience, even the parts that shape your decisions or emotions, dissolves almost instantly. And yet, you don't feel like you're fading. You feel whole. The you that wakes up each morning still feels like the same consciousness that fell asleep the night before, even though your brain has already rewritten large parts of yesterday. So what is that continuity made of? Maybe memory gives the illusion of permanence, while consciousness provides the reality of presence. Even without memory, you still perceive, feel, and exist in this very moment. If you close your eyes and forget everything about who you've been, your name, your history, your relationships, there's still something there, a silent awareness observing it all. Philosophers like Derek Parfit argued that personal identity isn't an unbroken line, but a chain of overlapping moments, what he called psychological continuity. You don't need perfect memory to be the same person. You only need enough overlap between who you were and who you are now. And yet even that overlap is fuzzy. The brain is constantly replacing memories, revising the past, and pruning neural connections. By adulthood, your brain has already discarded nearly half of its original neural pathways, a process known as synaptic pruning. It's efficient, but it also means the version of you that existed at 10, 15, 20 years old, quite literally, no longer exists in any physical form. So why do you still feel like the same person? Perhaps it's because identity is not stored in memory, but between memories, in the continuity of awareness that experiences them. That awareness might be what ancient traditions have always called the soul, not a mystical substance, but the ongoing field of experience that remains untouched by the changes it witnesses. Modern neuroscience is starting to approach this idea from a new direction. A 2024 study from the University of Toronto found that the brain's default mode network, the system most active when you're not focused on a task, plays a central role in generating the sense of self. It's the same network involved in daydreaming, reflection, and imagining your future. But here's what's strange. When people enter deep meditation or flow states, activity in that network decreases dramatically, yet they often report feeling more connected, more aware, more real. In other words, the self that emerges when memory and thought fall silent might be closer to our true nature than the one built on recollection. When memory fades, what's left is the raw texture of existence, the hum of being alive. That may explain why patients with advanced dementia sometimes display moments of striking lucidity. It's as if something beyond memory temporarily shines through. A study conducted by Columbia University reported that around 10% of Alzheimer's patients experience lucid episodes, brief windows where they suddenly regain recognition, clarity, or emotion despite massive memory loss. Doctors can't fully explain it. Some call it residual neural function. Others suggest it's consciousness momentarily realigning with itself. Whatever it is, it shows us that identity isn't linear. It doesn't live only in the stories we tell, but also in the awareness that watches them come and go. Maybe that's why, even when memory fades, love doesn't always vanish with it. Families describe how their loved ones, lost in the fog of dementia, still smile at familiar voices, still squeeze a hand, still cry when hearing a tender word. Those reactions are not rehearsed, they're instinctive. They belong to something beneath the mind, a resonance of connection that memory cannot fully define or destroy. So maybe the self isn't something that fades like ink, but something that outlasts the paper it's written on. Neuroscientists are beginning to recognize this through research on embodied cognition, the idea that the mind isn't confined to the brain, but distributed throughout the body. The heart, the gut, the nervous system all store traces of experience. The vagus nerve, for example, connects the brain to nearly every organ, creating a constant feedback loop between thought and sensation. When memory in the brain disappears, memory in the body can remain. A 2021 study from the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease found that even when patients could no longer recognize family members by name, their physiological responses, heart rate, micro-expressions, skin temperature, changed significantly when those same people entered the room. Their bodies remembered love even when their minds did not. It makes you wonder, what if the truest version of you isn't the one that remembers, but the one that feels? Maybe selfhood isn't an archive, but an atmosphere. The way your presence fills a space, the tone of your being that others recognize even when you forget yourself. It's not hard to imagine that in the end, we might not disappear at all. We might just dissolve into the awareness that has been watching from the beginning, the awareness that doesn't need a name to exist. And if that's true, then perhaps memory isn't the foundation of self, but merely its reflection, a tool the self uses to navigate time, not the thing that keeps it alive. Because beneath the stories, beneath the fading images, there's still a pulse, a consciousness that looks out at the world and quietly says, I am. Across the world, millions of people are trying to capture themselves, their stories, their moments, their memories, before they vanish. In photos, journals, and the endless scroll of digital posts, humanity is building an external brain, a global archive of identity. But what happens when your memories exist outside of you? Does that extension preserve who you are, or does it create a new version, one that looks like you, but isn't you at all? Neuroscientists call this cognitive offloading, the act of storing information externally so that the mind can focus elsewhere. According to research from Columbia University, more than 90% of adults now use digital devices as their primary memory storage. Dates, names, directions, all outsourced. We are remembering less internally, but documenting more than ever before. It's strange to think that humanity has built a world where memory doesn't have to live in the mind. You can forget a moment, yet still scroll through its record years later. But is that continuity or simulation? When you revisit an old photo, are you reconnecting with your past self? Or are you creating a new story about them? A new memory of the memory? A study from the University of California found that people who frequently document experiences for social media recall fewer authentic details of those events. Their brains record the act of capturing the moment, not the moment itself. We've begun to remember the representation more vividly than reality. So even as we build digital mirrors of our lives, we might be erasing the very essence we're trying to preserve. But maybe this isn't just loss. Maybe it's transformation. Technology is teaching us something profound about memory, that remembrance can exist without awareness. Our photos, videos, and data retain fragments of who we were long after we forget. In a sense, our devices have become extensions of our autobiographical memory, an external nervous system humming quietly in the cloud. This raises unsettling questions. If a person loses their memories, but their digital record remains, is that record a part of them? In Japan, researchers at Kyoto University have been experimenting with AI memory reconstruction, systems that use neural imaging to predict what a person is looking at or imagining, based purely on brain activity. These algorithms can recreate images from memory traces with up to 75% visual accuracy. It's astonishing and deeply eerie, because if technology can rebuild what the brain forgets, what does that say about the nature of identity? Is the self something that can be copied, translated, re-uploaded? Or is there something in us that no data can capture, something that breathes between the numbers? Philosophers and neuroscientists have begun calling this the continuity paradox. On one hand, a perfect digital replica of your memories could preserve your personality, voice, preferences, everything that defines you. On the other, if that replica doesn't possess awareness, is it really you or just your shadow? In 2024, MIT's Center for Brain, Mind and Machines conducted an experiment simulating memory implants in virtual avatars. Participants could interact with digital versions of themselves that possessed all their recorded memories, but no self-awareness. The result was striking. When asked if they felt represented, only 7% of participants said yes. The rest described the avatars as familiar strangers, or reflections without warmth. That phrase, reflections without warmth, captures something essential. It reminds us that selfhood isn't just information. It's sensation, emotion, the subtle electricity of being alive. You can duplicate memory, but you can't duplicate consciousness. This distinction becomes even clearer when you look at memory disorders. In conditions like Alzheimer's or Korsakoff's syndrome, large parts of autobiographical memory vanish. And yet, patients still respond emotionally, still show flashes of empathy, still laugh, cry, or comfort others. The self persists, not as data, but as presence. So even as humanity tries to externalize memory, maybe what we're really searching for is not to preserve information, but to preserve being. Technology might never capture that, because consciousness isn't a file to be saved. It's an experience unfolding in real time, a living flame, not a stored spark. Still, there's beauty in our attempts. Every journal entry, every photograph, every saved message is a small act of defiance against forgetting, a way of saying, I was here, I existed, remember me. But maybe the more honest question isn't whether the self fades with memory. It's whether the need to preserve memory is itself proof that something eternal exists beneath it. Why do we fear forgetting? Perhaps because some part of us senses that what we truly are can't be stored in any medium. Not in neurons, not in silicon, not in code. Even as science maps the mechanics of memory, it still can't define consciousness. After decades of research, the origin of awareness remains a mystery. The brain can lose memories, but not the ability to experience loss. That simple fact hints that consciousness might not depend entirely on memory at all. According to a 2023 survey of neuroscientists, nearly 61% now believe that consciousness arises from distributed systems beyond traditional memory networks, involving sensory integration and emotional resonance. In other words, what makes you you might be more about how you feel the world than how you remember it. And maybe that's what we've been missing all along. The recognition that the self is not a story, but a state of perceiving, connecting, and responding. You could lose every name you've ever known and still look at a sunset and feel awe. You could forget your life but still reach out to comfort another person's sadness. These are not memories, these are the living traces of consciousness itself, the part that endures when all else fades. If you've ever watched someone drift into deep sleep, you've seen a small version of forgetting. The mind loosens its grip. The sense of time, of story, of identity all begin to dissolve. Yet something remains. The body still breathes. The heart still beats. The awareness that dreams arise within, that quiet witness, stays awake even when memory sleeps. Every night we experience a temporary death of remembering, and every morning we return, piecing together who we are through memory's fragile thread. Maybe that rhythm, the daily fading and returning, is what prepares us for the larger forgettings in life. So much of being human depends on remembering. Our loves, our fears, our sense of purpose, all built on what has been. But as we've seen, memory is never perfect. It changes, fades, and reshapes itself with time. According to a long-term study from Harvard University, the average adult forgets more than 80% of the details of their life by age 60. Yet those same individuals still report a strong, stable sense of identity and self-continuity. In other words, we forget almost everything and still remain ourselves. Maybe that's the quiet miracle of consciousness, that it doesn't need a complete history to know that it is. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio once wrote that the self is not a collection of memories, but the feeling of what happens. It's the ongoing awareness of existence itself. That feeling doesn't require words or recollection. It exists right now, as you listen to these thoughts unfold, the gentle hum beneath your attention. And perhaps that's the answer we've been circling all along. If memory fades, the stories we tell about who we are dissolve, but the storyteller, the awareness behind the words, remains. You are not your memories, any more than a river is its ripples. You are the flow beneath them, always moving, always new. In this way, forgetting is not loss, it's return. When the mind lets go of its narratives, what's left is something quieter, but more real. The pure sense of being alive. Not I was, not I will be, but simply I am. There's something profoundly peaceful in that realization, because it means that even as your memories fade, your essence, the part of you that experiences, feels, and exists, never truly disappears. That might explain why people in the late stages of memory loss can still smile when the sun warms their face, or relax when they hear a familiar rhythm. The self may no longer remember its story, but it still knows how to be. In a study conducted by the University of Wisconsin, researchers found that patients with severe Alzheimer's still showed measurable emotional responses to pleasant stimuli, music, touch, and nature sounds, up to 30 minutes after exposure, even without any recollection of the experience. Memory faded instantly, but the feeling endured. That lingering response reveals something simple and profound. Memory can vanish, but consciousness still carries meaning. The experience itself leaves a trace, not in thought, but in being. And maybe that's where identity truly lives, not in what we hold on to, but in how we respond moment by moment. If you think of yourself as a story, then yes, forgetting feels like erasure. But if you think of yourself as awareness, the one watching the story unfold, then nothing essential can ever be lost. It's like a candle flame. Even if you blow it out, the heat lingers in the air for a moment, invisible but real. That's the self, not the flicker of memory, but the warmth that remains after it's gone. And if that's true, then perhaps we can meet the fading of memory not with fear, but with reverence, because it might be showing us what we really are beneath all the remembering, a presence that doesn't depend on the past to exist. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let yourself soften into that awareness. Let the mind release its grip on names, details, and moments. Feel the stillness beneath the noise, the place where memory and self blur into quiet being. Because in that silence, there's no forgetting, there's only presence.